Okay, so thank you for passing the baton, Tom. So, hi everyone, I'm Mike Trocchia, an environmental engineer with the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management, and I'm here to talk to you all about the new exemption that is again under consideration, much like the others, and this one is known as outdoor food waste composting. So, as with the prior speakers, please sit back, relax, and enjoy this portion of the show. So, as I just mentioned, this is a new and proposed exemption, and we need your input to truly refine this exemption before it is released with the updated rules. That being said, let's dig into the main topics for discussion today, which are the following. So, we will talk about operational requirements, bulking agents, operator training, daily records, and a few more topics. So we're actually quite excited to utilize this exemption to satisfy the needs of those entities that would like to preserve food waste composting operations outdoors and in wider spaces to meet the needs of the operations that are to be the subject of said activities. So we are here to help in any and every way that we can, so please feel free to voice your opinions or thoughts, and our moderators will get back to you as soon as possible, and at the end of my portion of the presentation, I can talk to you directly to assist. So as we discussed prior, please raise your hand with the meeting interface software, and our moderators will respond to your questions and we'll get back to you. All right, let's move on to more background information. Next slide, please. Okay, the basis behind this portion of the new and proposed food waste composting operation was to cover outdoor and large-scale types of operations. In accordance with Governor Murphy's goal to reduce greenhouse gases, our goal is to continually create rules to make his vision a reality to better the entire state of New Jersey. That being said, the outdoor composting operations are designed for wide open spaces such as farmlands, community fields, and other big pieces of land across our great state. Next, we'll talk about the latter part. Next slide, please. So this exemption is to be the smaller scale equivalent of current outdoor food waste composting operations currently taking place at Class C recycling centers across the state. It is our hope that this will continue and expand recycling across the state and allow us to reduce waste generated in the next coming years. This will bring order to another section of the potential wild west of recycling known as food waste composting, as more materials will be recycled and reused for worthwhile endeavors. Onward to more operational and related information to more clearly explain the department's points. Here we go. Next slide, please. Okay, here is a summary of the proposed exemption itself. First, we will start off with the allowed activities and materials. In order to properly commence the activities associated with this exemption, one must list the following: a gas permeable water repelling compost cover to prevent stormwater and other inconveniences from penetrating the operation itself, a leachate collection system to gather all of the runoff material, and an aerated blower designed to ensure continuous aerobic conditions. Then we have the qualifications for the operations itself that will be divulged to give more flavor behind how this food waste will be properly handled for the outdoor types of operations. Next slide, please. The first set of qualifications involves buffers. The department is stipulating that the owners of these exemptions shall maintain a certain buffer distance between the active operations and the property line. This is intended to mitigate disturbances to neighbors and is based on technological stipulations from the outdoor operation of composting, again based on the Class C regulations. Then there is the volume limitation, which is that the facility must receive less than or equal to a certain cubic yardage per year of source-separated food waste materials. Please note that this excludes meat, fat, oil, grease, bone, and dairy products. This limitation was devised based on yearly food waste incoming capacities for similar states presently conducting these operations or similar. The last phase of this process is the operational conductance mannerism and other precautions that must be followed. Next slide, please. The first operational clause stipulates that the operating entities must minimize odors, contact water, fire, and wildlife scavenging activities. After all, one does not want wild animals and various other pests eating your products and taking away from your potential business opportunities, right? Then the non-compostable portion of the food waste mixture must be removed by the end of the day to prevent adverse outcomes and damages to production. The kinds of materials that fit this operation are plastics, metals, contaminants, and anything else that would otherwise ruin the food waste mixture. Lastly, these kinds of operations cannot take place in residential areas. As the name suggests, this potential exemption would be much more suitable for wide open spaces. Onward to a little bit more background information. Next slide, please. Let us further discussion on the basics, shall we? Okay, now we will focus on the essentials that are proposed or under consideration, as we've mentioned before, to commence the outdoor food waste composting operations once again. So the piles must be less than or equal to a limitation, which will depend on the fire codes for the specific area that this operation may take place in. That being said, the fire code was one of the core factors behind why the designated height limit will be chosen. Then the bulking agent storage piles, such as the ones indicated below, are proposed to only go up to a certain quantity of material at any given time. This is in accordance with the operational capacities of the general equipment that will be utilized to conduct these operations. One must also ensure, as mentioned prior, that all runoff controls must be in place to minimize unintended and environmental harming outcomes. Furthermore, pathogen destruction must be ensured by keeping the mixture at least 55 degrees Celsius for a minimum of 3 consecutive days. This is in accordance with pathogen destruction studies and research on the subject, to kill all hazardous microbial living matter and other similar substances. Now, I realize you in the next food waste composting exemption, but it's important to emphasize as it is essential to prevent the formation of disease from arising and ruining the final product, along with mitigating the risks of other less than ideal outcomes from potentially occurring. So after pathogen destruction is properly handled and ensured, the finished volume of compost stored on site must be less than or equal to a certain quantity at any given time. Also, as with the bulking agent storage pile, this volume limitation is in accordance with equipment processing capabilities and compared on a scaled-down approach with Class C facilities, which are conducting larger-scale versions of these activities. Juxtaposing, let us shift to trained operators to conduct said operations and explore this subject area a little bit more. Next slide, please. So the person designated to lead the composting operations that are to be the subject of this exemption must obtain the proper certifications within 1 year of startup. The approved certifiable entities that are deemed appropriate to prepare and present the verifiable certification for this operation, that's a mouthful, are as follows: the U.S. Composting Council, county agricultural organizations, various resource management agents, Rutgers University, and a few other potentially department-approved entities. The last measure we will discuss will be more housekeeping oriented, so don't fall asleep. It's just as important as putting those mountains of leftovers into the compost pile to be reused. Next slide, please. Now we will talk about the daily records, and like I said, they're a little bit less exciting than the other topics that we've discussed, but very important to ensure that the operation is handled properly, efficiently, and effectively. So the forms will be available on the department's website when it is ready. These records must be maintained for a period of at least 3 years in an easily accessible format. This will ensure that you are prepared to deal with any and all situations that arise and will allow our enforcement coworkers to conduct their normal inspections properly. Looking at the records themselves, they should include the following. That includes incoming material totals, finished compost on site, and quantities of finished compost shipped. These quantities should be reported in cubic yards for ease, as Tom mentioned before. And lastly, the core mixture temperature needs to be recorded, as that feeds into the proper pathogen destruction clause we mentioned as well. Okay, now let's move on to probably one of the main reasons you're here, to answer some questions to help us refine and improve this exemption. Next slide, please. Okay, it's time for the first round of questions. So before we get into details, as we've done with the prior questions, I just want to reemphasize that all 3 of these questions should pop up in the poll questions screen via a link in the chat functionality and should be ready and waiting for you all to answer as you please. As always, you will have minute in total to answer all three of these questions on the slide, and this will carry on for the next 3 slides as well. Also, the last housekeeping measure to mention, these questions should be available for the next 24 hours after the presentation, and an email should follow with more details so you can easily access and answer the questions. So please don't worry, you'll be able to answer them when you're ready. Okay, the first question for the set is, what would be an appropriate buffer distance? Your choices are A, 50 feet, B, 75 feet, C, 100 feet, or D, a typed in quantity that you decide. Or if the polling feature allows, you may be able to select multiple options for some of these choices. Either way, again, please click on the link to find the choices that coincide with this question. Okay, the next question is, should the buffer distance vary depending on zoning? Your options are A, yes, B, no, or C, your own custom answer. The final question for the slide is, what would be appropriate volume limitations for incoming materials per year? Your options are A, 2,000 cubic yards per year, B, 4,000 cubic yards per year, C, 6,000 cubic yards per year, or D, your own custom choice. Wait, I'll give you all a minute to answer this. All right, it's been approximately 1 minute, so we will move on. Next slide, please. Okay, now we enter into the second round of questions. Brace yourselves because here we go. All right, this set will be broken up into 3 parts and is focused on the active compost, bulking agent, and curing piles. So the first question for this set is, what should the pile height limitation be for the active compost pile? Your choices are A, 4 feet, B, 6 feet, C, 8 feet, or D, other alternatives. The next question is, what should the pile height limitation be for the bulking agent pile? Your choices are A, 10 feet, B, 15 feet, C, 20 feet, or D, other options. And the final question for the slide is, what should the pile height limitation be for the curing piles? Your choices are A, 10 feet, B, 15 feet, C, 20 feet, or D, other choices. And I will give you a minute starting now. And please be aware that the local file codes will play a very large part in determining the limitations that are to be the subject of this exemption. Okay, it's been about 1 minute, so let's move on. Next slide, please. All right, so now we enter into the third round of questions. So this first question for this slide set will be, what should the storage volume limitations be for the bulking agent piles? Your choices are A, 500 cubic yards, B, 1,000 cubic yards, C, 2,000 cubic yards, or D, other alternatives. The next question for this slide is, what should the storage volume limitations be for the finished compost pile? Your options, should you choose to accept them, are multiple, if the latter is possible, are A, 750 cubic yards, B, 1,000 cubic yards, C, 3,000 cubic yards, or D, a type-in alternative. And the last question for this penultimate slide is, should the compost pile be required to be maintained at 55 degrees Celsius for 3 consecutive days? Your options are yes or no for this category. Once again, if you can't answer all these questions now, do not worry. You have 24 hours after the presentation. And with that, I will give you a minute starting now. All right, it's been roughly 1 minute, so we will move on to the last slide for my section. Next slide, okay? So this is the final set of questions. Are you ready? Here we come. All right, so the first question for this ultimate set is, what other organizations should be allowed to certify the operators? This is an open-ended question, so feel free to populate it with whatever you feel. The next question is, when should operators recertify? Your options are A, every year, B, every 3 years, C, every 5 years, or D, please express your thoughts here, and this is an open-ended option. And the final question for my slide in this part of the presentation is, are there any additional items to include in daily records? Your selection is open-ended, like the first question for the slide in option D, so please take your time and write whatever you feel would answer this question properly. And last time I'll say this, I promise, but after this presentation, these questions will be available for 24 hours. Your minute starts about now. And when the minute expires, we'll be able to open it up to you guys so you can answer some questions like we did at the end of Zafar and Tom's portion of the presentations.
You got it, Mike.
Thanks. All right, it's been roughly 1 minute, so we will open the floor up to you guys. So Judy, do we have any questions?
So far we have one. I'm going to call on Jay from Ag Voice.
Okay, go ahead, Jay.
Hello again. I can't believe that I'm going to say this out loud, so everybody better write this down. But I think this exemption should be scrapped now because this is just leading to nothing but problems. When I first started, I was running a much smaller turner, running much smaller rows, doing much lower volumes. And even at that, there was still a lot of potential for odor vectors. The covers work fantastic. We use them for the first, I don't know, 5 or 6 years of our operation. They do a great job shedding water, controlling storm water. We did a lot of work with Rutgers, verifying the usefulness of those covers, and they are fantastic. It's the food waste and the odors. Even if they do an aerated static pile, as soon as you crack into that pile, you're looking for, trouble emitting odors. Now, my current facility and even my previous facility, I had a half-mile buffer from me to any residence, any other structure. And
Yep.
still, every now and again, if we don't have everything just right, you can get an odor. There's a facility up in Wantage, New Jersey, and I won't call it out by name, but they're not doing food waste, and they still have odors that are traveling 3 and 4 miles away up to my in-laws' house. So my personal opinion on this is to scrap this exemption before it even gets started, because we're just begging for a problem.
Yeah, we know the odors can be a problem, but we're going to be very careful with, you know, how we regulate and to make sure that, like you said, those problems don't arise. So thanks for your comments. We'll take that into consideration.
So rather than exempting this, I would like to see more like what I've been proposing since we first started, that tiered approach, and maybe make this as the bottom tier, like the entry level tier above the in vessel, further above the micro scale, but maybe this is the entry level where there's still some oversight, because that's my big concern is, you know, not everybody, and this was coming from a DEP guy, you know, he had said to me at one point, you know, Mr. Fisher, not everybody's like you and your wife and operate your facility like you guys do. And he was right. I mean, not everybody tries to do the right thing. And I think that's where we're going to get into trouble if there's not some kind of, you know, regulation or somebody keeping an eye on these things. As it is now, there's a lot of exempt compost facilities. And I could rattle off a bunch right now that are taking in way more material than they're supposed to. They're taking in material that's like a tea leaf waste that to me falls under food waste. So, you know, when you start getting into these exemptions, there's a lot of people that take advantage of that.
Right, yeah, we like your mention of the tiered approach. That could be useful, and we'll be considering that in the future before we implement this. Don't worry. All right, thanks, Jay.
I was going to say, Jay, do you have anything else? I'll take that as a no. Next one up. Next one with the hand raised is Wayne DeFeo.
Hey, everybody. I have just 2 quick comments. First of all, I think it's great that you're doing all this, and I'm really impressed by the amount of input y'all are requesting. Not that I haven't had head-to-head debates with all of you, but this is the right approach, and you should be commended for it. 2 quick things. One is this concept of an arbitrary standard on distance and buffers. The buffers are not going to stop odor 50 feet, 100 feet, 1,000 feet. It almost it becomes superfluous. I've been as far as 5 miles away and smelled food waste facilities that have gone bad. So I'm not certain that accomplishes much, other than you do get a visual buffer and you can get sound buffers. Those things are certainly worth implementing. The only second point is that I'm not certain throwing this out is necessarily right, but I do agree the concept of exemptions and the whole exemption concept, even in vegetative waste, has caused nothing but confusion and issues with the regulated community and with the sites themselves. Because you're talking about thresholds. How many cubic yards is the threshold? How much? It's a fairly arbitrary decision. What I like the concept of a tiered approach. You're a low level if you do this, if you're a medium level if you do this, high level if you do that. You might want to base those on the volumes. But I think the exemption element, the way this is structured, I just think it's going to lead to a lot of confusion and a lot of regulatory problems between the facility and the county and the state. So I would just say approach this with caution, Michael, and consider the tiered approach to a permit and just use different permitting levels.
Okay, yeah, I agree with your point about, you know, buffers are difficult for odors, but, you know, we're working on ways to curb them the best we can. And like you and Jay said, the tiered approach could prove effective, and based on volumes, it may be the most effective. And we'll consider all that before we finalize the exemption. Don't worry, and thanks again for your comments.
Thank you.